Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Julian Baggini, who is, well, I guess it was, was at one point teaching philosophy and was involved in the, Philosophy Magazine and the World Institute of
The
Philosophy
Royal
and
Institute of Philosophy, yeah.
also the, the World Food Council,
Food Ethics Council.
food ethics. You've been involved in a lot of things, but I think you're best known for all of these books, which just keep coming at us. I don't know how you do this, and that's why we've had you back here a second time because you keep cranking them out. And the two latest books include this one most recently. It's called How the World Eats, a Global Food Philosophy, which I think follows up on an earlier book called Virtues of the Table, written many years ago. And it even kind of tangentially, there's a little bit in this book on the pig that wants to be eaten, 100 Experiments for the Armchair Philosopher. And then also this book, which came out 2 years ago, which is really a fantastic book, deserves to be a classic. It's called How to Think Like a Philosopher, 12 Key Principles for More Humane, Balanced, and Rational Thinking, which follows up on, I think, a short history of truth and how the world thinks. Welcome, Julian.
Well, I thank you for the introduction.
So, I mean, the reason why I like this book, How to Think Like a Philosopher, is, philosophy is one of those things which ordinary people can aspire to sort of be a philosopher in some way, right? To live like a philosopher. And this is very different from a lot of occupations. I mean, we can't aspire to be, neuroscientists, we can't aspire to be lawyers even, without a lot of formal training and a lot of domain expertise. But in a way, I think philosophy, even though it is an academic discipline and a highly, um, I don't know, rigorous academic discipline, is something that everyone can kind of aspire to. And I forget who it was that you quote in there who says that, if you can't explain things using ordinary language, then maybe you don't understand it.
Yeah.
And so one of the themes, of course, in the book is that, academic philosophy is sort of inaccessible, but we shouldn't mistake academic philosophy for being the only game in town for philosophy. So, I mean, is it realistic for all of us to kind of aspire to be thinking like philosophers?
Okay, so I'd want to make a distinction, which is automatically a philosophical thing, isn't it? I want to make a distinction between A and B.
Right.
Because the idea that we can all aspire to be philosophers, I think where that's really difficult and people get it wrong is if you want to sort of like make an original contribution to philosophical thought, that is really, really hard. And it's
Yeah.
very difficult to do without all the training because, you've got to, if you don't know what a couple of millennia of people have already done, you're going to make the same mistakes as them and you're not even going to notice their mistakes and so forth. And I think that's the real mistake I get. As someone who sort of publishes philosophy, I get kind of at least once a week, probably, an email from someone who's developed a new theory of X.
Right.
Every other week it's consciousness, and then on the other week it's something else. And I don't like to sort of mock because, I mean, these people are generally smart people. They're struggling to try and work things out, but they're doing it kind of extra on a blank sheet of paper. And they may have read some stuff, but they haven't had that really rigorous training. So to really make a contribution to philosophy, the idea we can just do that without any training, I think is very, very arrogant. But that's not the point. I haven't made a contribution to philosophy, I don't think. I mean, I might have hoped that a few of the things I said were might have shifted the dial a bit, put a different perspective on things. But what I'm doing is I'm kind of learning from all these great philosophers and I'm trying to put it together and I'm trying to apply it and I'm trying to sort of think and live accordingly. Now, that is something we can all aspire to, whether we are trained philosophers or not. So, living philosophically is something that doesn't require a deep academic training. I think that's a different distinction I'd make.
Right. And I think if we were to describe that way of life, I mean, it could be captured by this notion of like epistemic virtue,
Mm.
right? And it is indeed a virtue. So it's not just sort of I don't know, it's a way of thinking. It's a way of living
Mm.
to the extent that living involves thinking in everything you do.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things I think I've really people ask you sort of what have you changed your mind about and everything, and it's very difficult to spot that because there are very few moments in life where you literally switch from one thing to another. People go from atheist to Christian or vice versa, but most of the time your thinking evolves. But sometimes you come out the other end very different from where you started. And I think one thing I've really come to appreciate is you use this term epistemic virtue, which might sound like just jargon to people. And the way I'd put it is this: people often think that good thinking is a technical matter. You get your training in logic. You get to analyze whether a statement is fallacious, whether the conclusion follows from the premises, etc., etc. All of which are useful skills, to be sure. But there's a whole other side of good thinking, which is to do with what we call these epistemic virtues. And it's it describes the whole attitude you bring to your thinking. So Bernard Williams, the late great Bernard Williams, who interestingly enough himself said that he probably only was associated by one or two actually concrete ideas, but was a brilliant kind of commentator, made you think about things differently. In his last book, he talked about these virtues of sincerity and accuracy. And what he means is this: look, you want to think well, well, first of all, come with an attitude of sincerity, which is harder than it sounds, right? Because when most of us come to an issue, we're invested in a certain answer, for example, or we don't really have the patience to do things properly. So it's that genuine sincerity that I want to know what is true here, and I'm not going to allow myself to be sort of swayed by my prior assumptions and et cetera, and I really, really want to find out, even if the truth is uncomfortable. And then accuracy, which is I'm going to really try and make sure I get everything accurate, get the facts straight. Or not just the facts, but if I'm talking about an argument of someone I might disagree with, I'm going to try and get their position straight. I'm not going to straw man them. I'm not going to kind of like present their position in such a way that it's made to look less credible than it is. And I think that, those two things of sincerity and accuracy, they're the attitudes we bring to our thinking. And I think if you think about it, we're limited, we're all of us limited by our perhaps inherent intelligence. But if we're reasonably smart people and we approach any issue with that sincerity and accuracy, we're much, much more likely to come to the right conclusions than someone who's a brilliant logician, but who doesn't have those virtues. I know you know people, I'm sure. I know people. Listeners will know people who've got brains like the fastest supercomputers, but who basically always just want to win an argument and show why they're right and everything. And they can basically rationalize their way to any conclusion that they want. They don't have those virtues of sincerity and accuracy. And at the same time, they're people whose brains are quite slow. Philippa Foot described herself as that. A really great philosopher. But she had these virtues in spades, and she was patient and thoughtful, and she thought slowly. So when she came to a conclusion, it was a much, much more interesting one than people who perhaps had faster brains and a higher IQ, whatever it might be.
Well, I mean, that suggests that there's something about temperament that's important. And I guess Iris Murdoch made this point. And so what exactly is this philosophical temperament? Because, I mean, if you look at someone like Bernard Williams, I mean, I don't know, did anybody dislike him? I mean, he seemed like such a wonderful guy. But if you take a guy like Nietzsche, I mean, I bet nobody liked him. But they both had this idea of intellectual honesty,
Yeah.
right? And it seems like a temperamental thing, but it seems consistent with being both kind of nice and being kind of annoying.
Yeah. I don't know if temperament is the right word. I mean, I don't know. If you put that aside, I mean, okay, you make a distinction between character and personality, which is, I think, a very typical one to make. And the idea is personality are those aspects of yourself which are pretty much, if not innate, they're kind of, by the time you're 18, they're pretty much set. They don't shift much, like if you're introverted, extroverted, if you're visual or verbal. These are things to do with personality, which you can't really change much. Character is a different matter. Character is something that, people like Aristotle and Kongzi or Confucius said, and David Hume as well. You can work on that. You can change that. So, if you're a dishonest person, you can become honest. and vice versa, by the way. You're an honest person who can, by small steps, become dishonest. You can be a cowardly person who becomes brave because you feel you have to. Now, where does temperament fit on this? I'm not quite sure, because it sounds like you might think that's like personality, it's just something you're set with. But if we take it to be something a bit more like character, then I think there can be a philosophical temperament which you need to work on. And so, for example, if I was to look at myself, if I think about I'm only looking at myself not because I'm particularly interesting, but I think I'm the person I know the best. If I think about some of my more instinctive kind of habits, the way I might think, um, I don't know. I think if I could look back at my 20-year-old self, for example, I think I might have been too quickly dismissive of certain points of view, too critical a bit,
Mm.
cynical where I should have been just skeptical. And that's the kind of thing whereby trying to do philosophy properly, hopefully, I've got a bit better at that and I've helped to develop the temperament. So this is a long way of going back to your thing. How can people, very different people, personalities like Nietzsche and Williams, both have a good philosophical temperament? It's because whether they're sort of like amiable or unamiable, irritable or calm, whatever it might be, when it comes to their thinking, they are able to, really work those virtues. And that means they can both be great philosophers despite being very different people.
Well, I think one of the things that you talk about in this book is this notion of cognitive empathy, and I think part of this means that, and maybe this was true when you were younger, as soon as you discovered that there was an argument was bad, you just kind of flushed it down the toilet and ignored it. And I'm guessing you spend a lot more time now kind of really trying to figure out, what it is about these bad arguments that are so attractive to people, right? Which means that you have to, be very empathetic and you have to kind of put yourself in their shoes and so forth. And, this seems, I mean, almost like more of a, I don't know, literary talent than a philosophical talent.
Yeah. Well, well, yeah. I guess the boundaries between these ways of thinking are very slim. I mean, one of the chapters in the book I title it "Be a Psychologist" because I think there's a lot of psychology involved in being a good philosopher too, understanding perhaps people's motivations and where they're coming from.
And at one point, William James, I mean, going back that far, there really was no distinction, right, between
Yeah.
psychology and philosophy.
There is a date. Actually, I wanted to write about it on the centenary, and I missed it about 10 years ago. Around 1910 or whatever it was or something, a German university, I think, appointed the first chair of psychology, which was a chair of psychology and it wasn't separate from philosophy. And in a sense, that was the birth of psychology as a distinct discipline from philosophy. So these things branch off, very, very recent branching. So William James, of course, was around that time where psychology was becoming a separate discipline, but really hadn't yet properly separated. So yeah, so that cognitive empathy, trying to understand where people are coming from. I mean, it's so important because, I mean, first of all, what you find is that people are very rarely completely wrong. Sometimes they are, right? But even views that are very, very wrong and very, very mistaken indeed, often there's some kind of kernel of truth, and the problem is people have gone off in the wrong direction with it. I mean, I all feel slightly reluctant to sort of be too political in these things because one problem people have is as soon as they identify someone as being on a particular political view, they immediately become either friendly or skeptical of them. But I find it very hard not to.
This is the genetic
Yeah,
fallacy,
yeah.
right?
But I think
Yeah.
it's very difficult not to bring up examples. I think there are lots of things that are very wrong with what we broadly call the populist right in America and in Europe. But I think the problem that a lot of people on the what we call the progressive liberals, progressive left have is that they really struggle to understand that there are actually lots of quite genuine things going on there, which they are worried about. And actually, and some of them shouldn't be too surprising because they're very similar to what people on the left have been saying. So, if in particular, this idea, in the extreme, it's the view that the world is controlled by some secret cabal, some secret elite, right? Well, Chomsky was talking about the industrial military complex, right?
Yeah.
It's not so far away. So, if you ask yourself, are there certain
That's right. I mean, Big Pharma was an enemy of the left,
yeah,
as I mean, I don't know, fairly recently,
Yeah.
and now all of a sudden it's the enemy of the right, right?
Exactly, yeah. So, is it true that there's too much power has been concentrated in too few people and a small number of large economic interests get to have too much? Yes, absolutely, that's right. Now, the way in which the populist right has decided to react to that, I don't think is very helpful. And in the case of Trump, it's kind of, he's actually helping these forces. He's not even fighting them. But there are lots of things like that where, when you hear people's concerns, you go, yeah, there's something in that. And if you want to change people's minds as well, actually, first of all, I think most of the evidence suggests trying to change their minds directly isn't going to work. What you can do is you can get people to reflect a bit on what their views are, and they may then become a little bit less attached to them. Over time, they may give them up, but it's just that you can sort of like get them to see that things are a bit more questionable, not so straightforward. If you just try to say, well, that's wrong, you're mad, you're crazy, well, that's not going to work.
Well, yeah, I mean, so this idea of psychologizing, I mean, it seems like in some sense it's belittling and failing to take people seriously, right? Because you're looking for some psychological explanation for their beliefs. But I think you're trying to kind of say, hold on there, this may not be as condescending as it looks. It may actually be empathetic.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, but in a sense, I think what you're trying to do is you're not trying to. So there's a difference between what we're calling psychologizing there and, the principle of charity, which I advocate. So psychologizing, which I think is generally a bad thing, is trying to kind of, as it were, attribute what people think to some psychological motivation, which you think you can see. I mean, that's just very difficult. I mean, people's deep psychological motivations are not very clear to anyone, themselves or others. And people can be very quick to sort of like say, oh, we know, they're just insecure or whatever it might be, this all cod psychology type thing. But the principle of charity is to say, look, I don't know what these people's motives are, their deep psychological motivations are, but let's take their reasons seriously and let's try and see if there's anything in their arguments, right? So this isn't kind of trying to second guess people's personalities, how they feel. It's just trying to give the best possible hearing to what it is they have to say. And you can do that because that's much easier because you're working with things that are evident and clear and there, what they are saying and the reasons they give for it. Whereas psychologizing, it just ends up being speculation, essentially, often unfounded about what's going on under the surface. God knows what's going on under the surface.
Well, I mean, philosophy is supposed to bring clarity to your thinking, but a lot of people, like including philosophers like Philippa Foot, have said that a philosopher is someone um, with whom you have a conversation and you wind up more confused at the end than you did at the beginning,
Yeah.
right? And so, I mean, so it seems like philosophy, while sometimes it simplifies things, more often it complicates
Yeah,
things.
it does. But that brings a kind of clarity. The risk of repeating anecdotes I told before, but I do enjoy this one. When I did my book on free will, the first talk I gave about it was in Glasgow, and you can tell this is etched on my memory. And I gave the talk, and someone, any questions? First hand comes up, and they said, "I came to this talk because I wanted to understand free will better, and now I'm more confused than I was at the beginning."
You've done your job.
And I said, right, okay. I said, sorry, everyone demand your money back and leave. No, but
Mhm.
the serious answer is this. I think that what often happens is, right, so if you go from fuzzy to clear, often things look more complex, right? So if you imagine a sort of a fuzzy picture or something, there's not much
Well, it's like a
detail.
fractal, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
isn't it kind
And
of like
then
fractal?
once you start to see the detail, oh my God, it's complex. So I think what happens is with an issue like a lot of philosophical issues like free will, whatever it might be, people think it's clear because they've actually got a fairly fuzzy idea of what it's all about. It doesn't seem complicated to them. It's all a bit fuzzy, and and so it's not really clear, to be honest. But they just have this illusion it's clear because they haven't seen the detail. So the first stage is to bring out the complexity of the detail, and that will initially make you much more confused. But that's a necessary stage. But there is more clarity there, though. When you see all the complications, that's clearer than when you don't really, and you think it's more straightforward than it is.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that philosophers and scientists both believe is that you have to kind of follow the argument wherever it goes.
Mm.
Follow the evidence wherever it goes. And this sounds great in theory, but I think most people don't do that in practice. Um, I mean, is there a reason why perhaps we shouldn't? I mean, is there some insight we can get from our resistance to taking the argument wherever it leads?
Yeah, no, actually, I think so. I think the problem is, you see, our beliefs hang together. You can't just pick them off one by one. And I think you may have an argument which leads to a conclusion, and it seems to me the argument is irrefutable.
Mm,
But if that conclusion clashes with so much else which is well founded, you are right to pause. In fact, in The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten, The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten is mainly based on thought experiments
yeah.
that other people from literature and other philosophers. There are a few that I made up. And I made up one which was precisely about this. Someone has been presented with an argument, the conclusion of which is that what they ought to do is to, walk into a busy shopping mall and let off a bomb and kill everybody, right? Now, you don't need to know. People say, well, what kind of argument would that be? It doesn't matter. This is hypothetical. Let's say
Mm,
I gave you the argument and it actually, I'm an evil genius. The logic seems impeccable. There seems to be nothing to disagree with. Should you go and do it? And I think most people say, well, no. And he said, well, why not? It's impeccable. Follow the argument where it goes. Well, if the argument leads you somewhere that seems so evidently abhorrent, you don't do it, right? Yes. So I think that, and this is tricky because sometimes, most of the time, we don't follow the argument where it leads us because we just don't like the conclusion. We find it uncomfortable, whatever it might be. Sometimes I think we don't follow it to the conclusion because, quite rightly, we can see it jars with so much else we think is well founded. And also, if it jars with fundamental values as well, then that's a very good reason not to do it. So I think that there's something robotic about a kind of philosopher who simply sits down, comes out with an argument, reaches a conclusion, and then follows it. I think this is a little bit true of some utilitarian arguments, to be honest. So a lot of utilitarian arguments tell us that we basically aren't justified in showing any preference to friends or family or ourselves. We should be perfectly altruistic. And there are some people who think they can't see the error in the conclusion, so they try to act on it. And that means, and they all fail, because at the end of the day, you'd be a monster to sort of not go and look after your sick relative when you could instead be trying to save the world, for example, or whatever it might be, or not offer the money to a relative in need when the same amount of money could save other people. Human beings are fundamentally creatures who live in relation to others and with specific ties to some and not to others. We are not these objective gods who hang over the world. But there are people who, they see the argument, they can't escape the logic, so they struggle. They try really hard as they can, to follow that. I find that interesting.
yeah, I mean, when I found out that Peter Singer, put his mother in a retirement home that was very
Mm.
expensive, I think a lot of people were like, "Gotcha, there you go," and I was like, "Oh, actually, I respect this man a whole lot more now," right?
Yeah, but see, but what's interesting is, I find interesting is you put that to people, and what they'll say is it's not an argument against, not doesn't show they're wrong. All it means is that utilitarianism is very, very demanding, and that no human being can fully follow its
Mhm,
demands, but we should try as hard as we can to get as close as possible. Whereas for other people, it's like, no, this is actually showing there's something fundamentally wrong with it. Because if
mhm.
if a human being who did succeed in living as a utilitarian would not be a recognizable human being. They would be this kind of moral machine, simply, who who treat everybody the same, no matter whether they've known them for 50 years or met them 2 seconds. I mean, that sounds heroically altruistic in some ways, but it also sounds deeply inhuman in others, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that seems like an argument in favor of eclecticism, right? In other words,
Mm.
you know, there there's no if you strive for some single unifying philosophy that, where all the parts fit in with the whole, There's something fundamentally wrong with that, right?
Well, I'm not sure. I think that we should try to be as consistent as possible. I think there's something quite specific about moral philosophy, though, where I think what you're saying is true. I think that there is this temptation to think that there is a possible, as it were, theoretical unity, a single principle for which we could reduce ethics. And I think that isn't right, because ethics is about values ultimately and how we live together. And we have lots of different values. And it's the nature of values that they can't be reduced to formulas. You can't always weight them. They need to be traded against the other. So when it comes to ethics, I think that what one should think is that these moral theories, which students are taught to kind of think which one is correct, rather what they've done is they've all identified something really significant and important in ethics, but they've made the mistake of making that everything. And I can't remember, various people have said versions of this, but this is the fundamental mistake intellectuals make. They discover a part of the truth and they mistake it for the whole, right? So utilitarianism tells us that a significant aspect of our moral thinking should be the consequences of actions, good or bad, and that is fundamental. The deontologist tells us we need to think about our duties to other people and our responsibilities. The Confucians tell us we need to recognize the fact that we are social beings and that our particular moral obligations vary according to which social relation we're in. A father or mother has a different duty to a son or a daughter, a ruler, or whatever it might be. The virtue ethicists tell us we need to work on our character. The care ethicists tell us that actually care is in itself a value, and so on. They're all identifying important aspects of the moral life. And I think we should give up on the idea, which a lot of philosophers find horrible because they think you shouldn't give up on these things, that we can find a unifying theory that will link them. We try and sort of do justice to all of them, but there's a kind of a moral tragedy here in a sense that we can't do all of them. In a sense, there will be occasions where we have to sacrifice something of real value because we can't have both things. There was actually a very good film. Not many people saw it, I don't think. It's called The Good Son. It was Macaulay Culkin's attempt to escape his stereotyping as this good kid in Home Alone. And basically, he was this monster of a kid. And it was all about, how the parents... And I don't remember the details very well, but there's a literal kind of cliffhanger ending in which it's rather contrived, but it worked. The mother has got the two kids in her hand over the cliff, and she can't hold on to both. She's not strong enough. And in one hand is someone else's kid. He's an absolute angel. And in one hand is her monster of a son. And she's got to decide which one to let go of. Now, I won't give away the ending if you want to watch it. But there's a sense in which, whatever she does, she's doing something wrong. There isn't a right answer in a way, because a parent's duty to their children is kind of almost absolute. But on the other hand, if you're thinking, you've got to have that utilitarian thing as well. There's to let the better one die when there's so much of a difference is also a kind of moral injustice. So it's like whatever she chooses, there's some kind of moral injustice, and that's because it's in the nature of values that sometimes we can't achieve all of them. We have to sacrifice one for another.
Well, I mean, you mentioned just now a movie, and it's a kind of a popular movie. One of the chapters of the book is about being eclectic, and to be a good philosopher, to think like a philosopher, you need to spend a lot of time with history and literature and other domains of knowledge, right? You have to become sort of a polymath, right? And it seems like, I mean, if you are getting formal philosophical training, you're probably not going to get a lot of that. I mean, this goes. I think I forget who I was speaking to about the bookshelf problem, right? Like, where do you put this stuff in? I think every chapter has a little quote from Dostoevsky,
Yeah.
right? And I don't know. I've taken a class on Dostoevsky, but it wasn't in the philosophy department.
Yeah.
It was in the Russian literature department.
Well, yeah, but I mean, obviously you can't you can't spread, you can't do everything. But I think having the diversity of sources is really important. Again, maybe not for certain kinds of academic philosophy. A very narrow range of study might work. If you're trying to, do something in a very specific aspect of formal logic, there's probably not much use in going off and reading Dostoevsky. But I think a lot of the most, living philosophically, you've got to. I think it's partly about trying to join the dots, and you can't join the dots if you're only looking at a small subset of them. And I think even academic philosophers, they do sometimes, I think, fail because they don't recognize that they're thinking about things other things are thinking about. So the example I go back to a lot is John Searle wrote a book, and it was called something like The Construction of Social Reality, something like this.
Berger and Luckman, but I mean,
Yeah,
surely he must have read Berger and Luckman.
Clearly
right?
not. This is the point. You know what I mean? Evidently not. I interviewed him about the book. So there's a sociology book with almost the same title, you said. But, these philosophers, they don't read sociology. In fact, a lot of philosophers are very rude about sociology. So he starts talking about these things. And there's some perfectly sensible things in the book. But actually, do you know what? People have been ploughing that field for a while. You could look and see what they managed to sort of come up with. And these sort of things happen all the time, I think, where people don't recognize the value. And in academic life now, there's a lot of emphasis placed on interdisciplinarity. If you want to get a research grant, if you can display interdisciplinarity, that's usually a good thing. But I don't think it's quite gone far enough. And every now and again, I like to advocate for this. I want to be appointed. I've been a freelance for ages, but there's one job I would take if it was offered to me, which it won't. Would be kind of like the professor, or it's got to be, I'll take reader, but professor would be nice, of syncretic studies or something. So what you need is you want someone. I think there should be someone.
I'll take that job also.
Yeah, there should be someone in the university whose job it is actually not to be the specialist. Someone who, and I might not get the job because there'd be people better at this than me, but people who have demonstrated certain abilities in their field, etc., but whose job it is actually is to kind of look around the university, put people together, run seminars with people in different departments, etc., and try and join those dots. Because again, this is like this is one of my hobby horses. But we have breadth and we have depth, and people talk about the trade-off between the two. But often the assumption there is that depth is the real thing. Breadth is thin, depth is thick. Now, I mean, slightly convoluted, sort of like physics metaphor, but space and time are relative, right? So you flip the axes 90. Your depth, they're just two axes that go in this direction. They both have, you could call depth breadth, and you call breadth depth if you like. There's a certain depth in being able to look at an issue across a broad range of disciplines, that you, in a sense, you do have a deeper knowledge of it because you have a knowledge which goes into lots of disciplines. And if you're simply in one field, and I think that it's not that one's the best way and one's the wrong way, it's that we should have both. But academic life only really rewards the narrow depth. So I really think there should be space for we call them the horizontal thinkers, not because they're lying down all the time, but because they join the dots across disciplines. I still don't see it happening, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, this gets back to the idea of virtue. One of the virtues you talk about in the book is knowing when to dig deeper and when to, dig less deep, right?
Yeah.
Like figuring out where to allocate your effort when it comes to thinking.
Yeah, I mean, thinking has opportunity costs, phrase we picked up from economists. Thank you, economists. Another little bit of interdisciplinary pillage. So the opportunity cost is that if you do one thing, then you can't do something else, and that other thing could be more valuable than the thing you're doing. I find this really very interesting because, for example, I am an atheist. I've written about atheism. But I don't really read much about it anymore, write much about it, the odd bit here and there. And there are people who do a whole career out of it. And sometimes that's because they are moving from one aspect to another, and et cetera. But sometimes it's because they're, or they're reading about it, they're just going over the same things again and again. And I think why? If you've thought about this for a long time, you've reached your position. Sure, be open to adopting it, all that kind of stuff. But do you really need to sort of like prove to yourself once more by a different point that religion is ridiculous, or read another book which tells you how brilliant Jesus was, whatever. You've spent time on that. You've worked it out. Now, you've got only a few years left on Earth, which is true even if you're young. It's only a few, really. Why not use that time to find out much more about something that you don't know much about? But this is a problem professionally for me because I do move. My books have been on different issues and everything,
Yeah.
and I do think, unfortunately, the people in the ideas world who often, you need a brand, and the brand is often a very particular kind of style, which I don't perhaps have, or it's a kind of a thing you keep going back to and banging that drum. So yeah, professionally it's not a very good idea, but I hope intellectually it's quite good.
Well, I think you say you can take a philosophical approach to any domain, and including food, right?
Yeah.
So, this latest book, and I mean, I've always thought that food is such an integral part of life that it should be done, consumed, right, in a thoughtful way. I
Yeah.
mean, not just sort of what you eat, but sort of how you eat, who you eat with, right? I mean, it's something you do every single day, and so, why not do it in a thoughtful way?
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, food's been an interest of mine for ages, and partly because I enjoy eating it, but I do find it so fascinating. And I did a book about 10 years ago, The Virtues of the Table, you mentioned in the introduction. And that was kind of, really thinking about how to live through the lens of food. That was what you might call like an armchair book. It's a book you could do by looking up a few facts here and there, but it was mainly based on years of reflection and joining dots, etc. But it led me into thinking about food more, and I joined the Food Ethics Council, and I just was aware the food system is really, really complicated, and people have very strong views about, whether we should be eating organic or vegetarian or local, all these things, and I just found that every time you looked into things, things were much, much more complicated than you thought. So what's interesting about that book is it's called A Global Food Philosophy, and I'm a philosopher. But it's not really a work of philosophy. I think I'm bringing my philosophical skills to it, I hope, because it's the skills of analysis and connection, etc.
Well, and knowing how to get the facts right.
And getting the facts right. Yeah, there's a lot of that. So many facts are just, you really have to be careful with the evidence on this. There's so many, these zombie statistics are walking around, that have been debunked years ago, but people still cite them. And then the philosophy in the title is like a philosophy in the sense of a set of principles, right? So I am using my philosophical skills. I was trying to look at the food system historically, globally, and ask the question, well, are there any common principles? When the food system's working the way it should be, and should is a judgment we make, are there any unifying principles? And I thought there were. And also, quite interestingly, I thought they were, in a way, quite obvious once you notice them. But also, interestingly, they're obvious and yet obviously not being followed. That, I think, is potentially a powerful idea, because when you want things to change, but the kind of direction you want to change them in requires a really strong argument, it's a real difficult. But if you want things to change, you can say, look, surely everyone can agree this is how it should be and this is the way it isn't. Then I think you have a great opportunity to bring change around.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like these movements like vegetarianism and veganism and anti-GMO, which we see in the Western
Yeah.
modern world. I mean, these are, I think they're attempts to kind of bring ritual and meaning back into food, right? Because it had kind of been stripped out of food in the West, right? Where it sort of acquired this, mechanistic, utilitarian,
Yeah.
refueling idea. And so, I mean, in that sense, I'm I'm heartened by it, but I'm also a little bit disappointed by the lack of kind of rigor and thought that goes into a lot of these movements.
Well, I think I share that ambivalence, because when I talk about this, I always try to be careful, because I'm not a vegetarian or a vegan. I call myself a conscientious omnivore, so I actually don't eat a lot of meat. but the meat and dairy I eat, I try and make sure is high welfare.
Yeah.
And it's really weird that the people like me are very unusual. Most people are just either they're carnivore, omnivores, or they're vegetarian or vegan.
Yeah, they'll get their chicken at Costco, or they won't even,
Yeah.
eat honey or whatever.
Also, this thing where people, if in their groceries, they'll buy the organic free-range chicken, but if they're out, they'll have the chicken at the sandwich shop, which is
Yeah.
probably the worst kind of factory chicken. But what I always say is, I don't want to make it clear that I want to applaud the vegetarians and vegans, because they are about the less than 10% in most countries of the population who are actually thinking about the suffering caused to farm animals and are trying to do the right thing about it. Now, the fact that I think the optimal way of doing this is actually good farming, that's besides the point. They're still doing better than 90% of the people, and they're caring and they're thinking. So I don't want to be too critical. I think this is sometimes the problem with lots of domains, actually, the sort of narcissism, a small difference, that people end up being too critical of people who are kind of facing on the wrong side. I have this problem also with organics, because every now and again I annoy the people in the organic movement, because I'll write something which is basically telling us that organics has its virtues, but it's not the solution. And if we have a simple binary between organic and non-organic, we're just missing all sorts of opportunities to make farming better, and that we can't all go organic anyway, etc., etc. And it's very difficult to do that in a way that makes it clear that you're not having a go at the organic sector for trying to do as well as it could. So again, I always say to people, look, I'm a member of the Soil Association, is a UK organics certifying body. I am a member of the Organics Soil Association. I often buy organics. I'm not bashing it, but we've got to be clear that, the idea that this is the solution and that it's that or rapacious industrial agriculture is a horribly crude caricature of the complex reality of agroecological farming.
But it seems if you really care about how to live, you have to do so much research, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have to really know your stuff. I mean, this could create like an almost unbearable burden on you, right? Where there are moral consequences to, everything you eat and everything you wear. And, I mean, at some point people just give up because they can't manage.
Yeah, I agree. But I tell you what, I think this is the other problem. Again, I think I've shifted my mind on a bit as well. I think really important to recognize that with things, we live in a really complicated world, and the problems are with the system. And the point is that a lot of people, the solution, and they don't think about it in these ways, but in effect, they are taking a consumerist solution. They're thinking that what I need to do is I need to buy the right things and not buy the wrong things.
Right? Clean hands. I have clean hands.
Yeah.
But
it's also
I'm taintless.
But it's also, that's about how change is going to come about. People like me buying the right thing. And it isn't. That's not how change is going to go about. People have been trying to shop. Ethical consumerism has been a movement for years, and it's achieved lots of good things. Again, don't want to knock it, but that's not the way change is going to come about. It's going to come about through the systems. Give you an example, recycling. When I was a student, we had to take our recycling to the bottle bank, and that was it. Cardboard and paper and glass, nothing else was recycled. We went to the bottle bank. Most people didn't. The big change happened because local authorities started collecting recycling curbside. That was the big change. It was a system change. Of course, I should try to do the right thing and recycle my bottles, but that wasn't the thing that was going to bring around the system change. Now, if I go back to food and farming and everything, I think people, and I think I'm going to say this, should agonize a bit less. Yes, try and do the right thing, but don't sort of it's not sin and dirtiness. If you do, eat the wrong thing sometimes, if you can't always buy the right thing, if you make a mistake, if all these years you've been buying avocados thinking they're good, and then you discover that where your avocados are coming from, it's ruining the forest, that's a mistake. You can't be informed about everything. So I think we should be a little less neurotic about is this clean, dirty, is this good, bad? Try and do the right thing, but actually it's a system change that's most important. And so the most important thing you can do as an individual is influence organizations and things you're around with. What about your school? What's your school doing for food? I mean, crikey, I'm in France at the moment, and I just got the local newsletter from the school. The local schools here, they have a local chef. They have a good chef. They favour local sourcing. They're 30% organic in their ingredients. They spend €3 a day on the food for the kids, and it's wow, that's great, right? Now, in a lot of British schools, it's terrible, and that's partly because they don't have the resources for it. Hospitals. So you got a school. Get your school buying the right stuff and feeding the right stuff. That's going to affect like several hundred kids, which is much more than you can affect with your shopping basket. Sports club. I'm a member of a tennis club. We're trying to get our tennis club to do the right thing with the environment and things. And the changes we can bring about there are much bigger. And it provides an example as well, because the tennis club doing things means all the members do it. So I think we put far too much emphasis on us as individuals. And as I say, the problem with that is what people don't realize is that a lot of people who do these things are against the kind of individualistic consumerist culture, but it's an individualist consumerist mindset which tells us the most important thing is what we do as individuals with our shopping.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you mentioned that thinking is something that should be done sort of as a team sport,
Yeah.
right? And so not only do you have to kind of go out into the world and try to make the world a better place, but even your process of thinking is ultimately a social one, right?
Yeah.
And that goes, I mean, I think the typical view of the philosopher is someone who's in the ivory tower,
Mm.
poring over books and reflecting on themselves. I don't know where this impression came from, because that's certainly not what Socrates did.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I think that's right. And I think what's interesting there is, again, that the research in psychology is showing this is right. So there's a great thing. I've been doing it for years and years and years ago. I did some little training thing with my former colleague at the Flossers magazine, Jeremy Stanger. We did the Watson test thing, where
Yeah.
you kind of, it's a little cognitive task. And if you do it in abstract terms, you give people an abstract problem, shapes and numbers, about 85% get it wrong. You put it in the social context, you ask about whether people underage are allowed to drink, they get it right 85% of the time. It's a
I
really
do that in my
interesting
class
demonstration.
every year.
Yeah, I love it. It's great. But what I discovered fairly years after that was actually if you give that task in people in groups to do, they do really, really well. So the so-called cognitive failures we have, it shows how stupid we are, bad we are at abstract thought. Well, that's when we try and do things privately by ourselves. And I think in general, yeah, absolutely, thinking with others. So this has become my mantra. I actually got a fridge magnet made with this on it. It's think for yourself, not by yourself. Think for yourself is important. Don't just accept what you're told.
So you have to keep groupthink at bay as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. But talking things through others, getting other perspectives, it can often be really helpful. In fact, sometimes even without the input of other people, there's something about talking about it with someone else which is helpful. I'll ask you and listeners as well, they all have this experience. How many times have you been thinking about something and you start to explain your problem to somebody else, and by the time you finish the explanation, you already realized part of what the answer is, right? It's really it's almost magical. Sharing, even without having the direct input, seems to have this help us to think. So yeah, don't think by yourself. I have to say, there's some people struggle with this, because particularly people interested in philosophy, people can find it really hard to find people to talk about philosophy with. Most people think you're a bit weird if you do. And that can be difficult. I would have hoped that in the days of the internet, it was more possible to find sort of like online ways of doing it, for sure. But yeah.
I mean, well, does audience matter? I mean, can a philosopher actually learn something by talking to people who aren't philosophers? And I don't mean sort of, literary creators and so forth, but just general audience. When you actually are forced to write for a general audience, does this in any way serve to sharpen your thinking that in a way you couldn't get when you were talking to a fellow philosopher?
Well, yes, but I mean, it's not just when you said about writing. There's the idea. I think trying to make your ideas as clear as possible is very, very helpful. And actually, I think Kieran Setti and people he's spoken to, lots of philosophers who've done it for the general audience, they all say the same thing. But the talking to is really interesting. So I live in Bristol in the UK. And I've been running for quite a long time this thing we call philosophical times. So we have a group of people. We limit the numbers to about 30 odd, so it's quite small. And together we choose something that's been in the news, and we take some kind of philosophical issue that arises from it, right? So I don't know. So for example, it might be something obvious like assisted dying, but it might be something less obvious, like there might be something around free speech. I can't think of the less obvious ones now. But what's interesting there is, so I'm not just a facilitator who just goes you. I try to sort of give some philosophical input on things,
Mm.
but there's a lot of participant input, and I'm constantly find that people will say things without any philosophical training, which are really interesting points, very worthwhile points. They make you think about it in a different way. And actually, often, a lot of the time, the thing is that when you get into a purely philosophical setting, people, there's kind of a set list of kind of what the key issues are, pros and cons. And sometimes someone from the outside would just come in with something totally different. You go, well, yeah, that's right. That's a good point. So yeah, I get a lot out of those discussions. I really do.
One of the things that I'm doing since our last podcast is joined a group here at UC Berkeley of faculty members, and we get meet every other week and we read a philosophical text. And so we've been reading Hume for the last
Right. Oh, wow.
you know,
Which one?
couple years, and it's cool because we have philosophers, we have historians, we have literature professors, we even have some business school folks like myself, and we kind of go through these texts and kind of do some deep reading and close reading and talk about it. And it's really cool. I mean, I don't think universities do enough to kind of promote faculty spending time with each other across
Yeah.
disciplines.
I agree. And that's the kind of thing. That's you're this sort of unofficial professor of syncretic studies bringing this thing together. This post. No, I absolutely agree. And sadly, it's getting worse. It's getting worse in the UK. The pressures on the academics are such that even within the same department, they don't get together so much. So to give an example of this, many years ago, I lived in Manchester, and I used to go along to the research seminars of the two universities, and they were great occasions. These are like once a week of visiting. Someone comes from another university, gives a talk, they discuss it, and it was great. And what happened was they would do it at like 5 o'clock on a Wednesday, whatever it was. Questions at 7 o'clock. Then they'd go out for a drink and go out for dinner, and this is the way it would work. Where I am now, I won't name it, but the university near me now, that's just gone. They have the research seminar. They do it like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They'll serve a cup of tea, and everyone disappears
Mm.
because they just don't feel they have the time to do it. I think this is such a shame, because one of the things about good thinking actually is good anything is you need space, you need gaps, you need time. You also need opportunities for like serendipitous things. So there's a really good book I recommend called Daily Rituals by Mason Curry. You can put it in the show notes, as they call it. And it's a lovely idea. He's basically just found out how creative people, scientists and artists and everything, have spent their days.
Mhm.
And they're all really different. But what I found really interesting is that there is a kind of pattern, which is that more often than not, they spend about 3 to 4 hours a day doing what they do: writing, composing, painting. They all have kind of routines, but a lot of the time, in the rest of the time, they're going for a walk, or they're having lunch with friends, or whatever else might be. And you see that this isn't an accident. In order to sort of like have this creativity, you need the time doing it, but you also need time doing other things. And that kind of fuels it, and it creates a virtuous cycle. I think in intellectual life, people need space, they need time just to have sort of like conversations which are not exactly about their own work. They need to meet other people, and they also need to relax and play tennis, whatever it might be. And academic life has now become so tough that I fear people aren't able to do that. And I think there's a price to be paid.
Yeah, I visited Oxford last year, and that was my first time, and I couldn't believe it. It's like, I mean, I couldn't figure out when do these people work? I mean, beginning at 5 o'clock and going to get sherry and then having dinner and then port and then going after and hanging out. And I was like, all my colleagues, they're working from 8 a.m. until, midnight, more or less.
Oxford, yeah, Oxford and Cambridge are the absolute exceptions to every kind of rule. They are worlds unto themselves, and they are these little bastions of absolute privilege. And one of the other good things about them as well, though, is they still have that college system, and so they have the dining and the lunches, and some of it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, and they're not also, I mean, apart from some, like Nuffield is just social
Yeah,
science, but in if you go to Merton,
yeah,
I mean, you've got like a string
yeah,
theorist and
exactly, exactly.
a Spanish theater person, and they're all at the high table together.
Exactly. So Nora O'Neill, for example, one of the people I interviewed and I mentioned in How to Think Like a Philosopher, yeah, she talks about that. The thing she really valued about her college life at Cambridge was that she'd be having lunch and she could be next to people with different disciplines, and she just found that really enriching intellectually. That's kind of the ideal of how a university should be. There are, of course, lots of things about the privilege of Oxford and Cambridge which are utterly objectionable and retrograde and should be abolished. But the idea that a university should be a space in which the academics mingle with other academics of different disciplines and have time to talk or whatever is wonderful.
Now, you quote Thomas Scanlon, who said that, emotions can be reasons.
Mm.
Um, I mean, do you think that philosophy now is starting to be more, um, I don't know, inclusive with respect to where insight can come from?
That's a good question. I don't really know. I guess I've always kept a little toe in the academic world, had contacts there, but I'm not quite sure about that. I think it's more open into who it can come from, right? I think that's really important, and I think we've got to give a lot of credit to people like Miranda Fricker and Ray Langton and people like that who've talked about this idea of epistemic injustice, this idea that actually there are people who are just simply not heard. And because they're not heard, we don't get their testimony and we form all our ideas on the basis of a select bunch of people who don't have the full insight. So I think that there has been a lot more opening up to the voices that come in. Where we get things from is trickier. And I also think I find this slightly tricky myself because I think sometimes people have this idea, they go, oh, the problem with philosophy is that it's all so rational. And what about intuition? And what about feeling? And what about insight, etc., etc.? I guess I kind of a little bit halfway on that in the sense that I think that things have got to be put to the test of rational scrutiny.
Hmm.
Otherwise, who knows? If someone says, I've had this insight, I'm convinced it's true, believe me, where do you go from that? Because people have those insights which are completely contradictory. So I think that, but where things can come from initially, who knows? And I think what's interesting about that is that pretty much any intellectual insight, even in philosophy, if you ask where does it come from originally, who knows? Who knows? I mean, people don't generally come to a conclusion by writing down some premises and then reaching a conclusion. What normally happens is that people will be thinking about something, and then at some point they go, ah. Now, where did that come from? All right, where did that come from? When they write it out, they will provide the framework and the arguments and the reasons. But where it came from initially, nobody knows that. So I think, but it's got to be put to the test of reason, I'm afraid. I'm old-fashioned in that respect. I'm not
Well,
that.
it's like that deist view of revelation, right? So, revelation is when you come to some true belief, that survives the test of reason, but you didn't kind of come to it initially through reason, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So what about, I think you quoted Richard Feynman, who said that, scientists don't need philosophy of science any more than, birds need to know about ornithology.
Yeah.
But it does seem that no matter what you're doing, it can't possibly but improve if you have sort of a philosophy of what it is that you're doing.
Well, not quite. I mean, I think there are a lot of creative people, for example, for whom kind of philosophical reflection would be death. I mean, yeah,
Mm.
lots of. I mean, artists do not work all in the same way, and some of them use like philosophical reflections very, very thoroughly. But a lot of
So
people,
so it could actually be
it
dangerous
could be,
to what it is.
it could
Yeah.
interfere. Yeah, it could interfere, I think. So I don't think it's a case of almost, but a lot of things would benefit from a kind of philosophical outlook. But then I guess the other counter argument to that is the some people have said, oh, you said how to think like a philosopher, but this actually sounds like how to think like a historian, or how to think like, their discipline, say this is just good thinking. And in a way I say, well, yeah, but that's kind of the point, because good philosophical thinking is just good thinking. You could use it in different domains. Absolutely, that's true. What Feynman was saying about that was that philosophy of science is basically largely trying to think about what science is, the kind of truths it comes up with, and the way in which it proceeds. And I don't think that's a lot of it is meant to be useful to scientists. But on the other hand, some philosophy of science, I think, is and has been. We've got a guy called Samir Okasha of philosophy of biology at the University of Bristol. And as I understand it, his work is read by a lot of biologists. He helps them to think about how they conceptualize their findings and so forth, and they do find it useful. But not everyone is, not everyone, but not everyone has to. If I'm interested in the question, for example, about okay, let's take a simplistic way of looking at it. Does science discover facts about the world, or is it just constructing models to help us to navigate it? That's an interesting question if you're interested in that. As a working scientist, you may have no interest, and you may just do your science.
Right.
So you may have no interest in that aspect of philosophy of science. But I think that's the problem. I think the people who just dismiss philosophy of science as irrelevant are usually just focusing on that. They think that philosophy of science is supposed to be there to help scientists do their work. They don't find it useful, therefore it's rubbish. That's a bad argument, which listeners can work out why it's bad themselves.
Well, I mean, the other thing you said is that attention is kind of like the secret sauce. So in other words, good reasoning is, of course, important. And that's, I think, what most people think of when they think of philosophy. But good reasoning is not enough, right? You need to supplement it with the right kind of attention.
Yeah.
Why don't we give enough attention to attention?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a curious one, this. Again, this is something that I've come just more and more and more convinced about over the years. Because again, the official version of philosophy is about argument and reason. So it's facts and argument. It's all about the sort of nuts and bolts. But what's really interesting is that when you look at almost all the great philosophers, what they really did was they noticed something important about what it was they were thinking about, which other people had not noticed. They were paying attention.
So they're not just paying attention to the world, they're paying attention to their own thought process.
Yes, as well. Pay attention to arguments. So, I mean, you can teach rules around fallacy, etc., etc., etc. But if you didn't know anything about logic, but you were really paying attention to an argument, you'd probably spot where they went wrong if you paid good attention, right? Descartes' initially, I think, therefore I am, is looks like an argument, but actually, if you that subversion in the meditations, it's just I am, I exist. What he's doing there, he's paying attention to what it is he can and cannot doubt, and he notices that it's impossible for him to doubt that he is thinking, because when he doubts that he is thinking, right? That's paying close attention to what's going on. It's not about it's not a rational argument, right? And time and again, you find that. So that attentiveness, and I think it's also attentiveness is important because I think in some debates they become scholastic in the sense that a question arises in philosophy, it gets formulated, and people go after the answers. But people aren't paying attention as to why we're asking the question in the first place. Now, I found this, I did my PhD on personal identity, and I found this time and time again in that people had a theory of what personal identity comprised, or what made personal identity. But it seemed to me what they were doing was they were approaching the issue as though it were a puzzle in the logic of identity. Identity is a logical concept, A equals B. What is it that can make A equals B in the case of a person? And so they find the only solution that can satisfy those conditions of identity, right? This is the tail wagging the dog. We talk about personal identity, but why are we interested in this question? We want to know what makes a person the same person over time. And if you pay attention to that, I think what you first notice is that obviously we can't be talking about identity in the strict sense, because sameness in terms of a person over time is always a matter of degree. So it's not actually the logic of identity is the wrong logic, the wrong way of looking at this. It's just the wrong way of looking at it. You pay attention to what you are concerned about in the question, which I think is more existential, and you realize has to be something else, has to be about what matters in survival, as Derek Parfit put it.
So this is not crossword puzzles writ large, right?
No.
I forget who made that quote. And I think you have your own quote, which is attendo ergo sum philosophus, right? That's your,
Yeah.
that's going to be your on your tombstone, right?
Yeah, no, I don't know. I think I think on my tombstone, was that it?
Well, okay, last question. You introduced this term technophronesis
Okay.
at the end of How the World Eats. And, it seems like, phronesis obviously is the meta virtue that we all should aspire to. And it can apply in almost all domains,
Mm.
right? So what exactly is technophronesis?
Technophronesis.
And
That's a very specific thing. Yeah. It's
yeah,
between technophilia and technophobia. I think that you have the technophobes who basically, oh, technology bad, send it away. We don't want it. AI is going to kill us. The internet's going to melt our brains, smartphones, whatever. You get the technophiles, which is the opposite. Hey, technology is going to save us. Don't worry about the planet, dude. We're going to zap the CO2. Don't worry about meat. We're going to grow it in. And, I think that phronesis is like practical judgment, practical wisdom. It's trying to sort of make that judgment of what technologies are good and bad, how they should be used to make them good or bad, how much to embrace them, how much not to embrace them. It's really important in the world of food because there's lots of technologies which have really helped us with our food production. I think there are other technologies which have been horribly misused and have helped create some of the problems we got. And you can't be a technophile or a technophobe in a simple way. You've got to look at all these different technical things on the table and think, what is the appropriate way to use them, not to be over dependent on them, but not to spurn the opportunities as well. And I guess that also comes to the rest of life as well. I've got a smartphone. It can be very annoying in lots of ways. It can be problematic. It can also be absolutely brilliant in little ways we take for granted. I'm actually, like a lot of people, thanks to a stupid little free app, as it were, I'm identifying more bird songs. My walks are just becoming more interesting. I'm becoming a little bit more aware of my environment because of something on my pocket computer, which is what it is. On the other hand, if I find myself sitting still for 2 minutes, I can find myself looking at it, which is bad because I should be abiding. Technophronesis, I'm not there yet. I'm trying to get the right attitude towards my technology.
well, that sounds like the name of my next course. I like it. I'm gonna steal it. Awesome. Julian, thanks so much for joining me. This is really a wonderful book, How to Think Like a Philosopher. I recommend it to everybody who thinks, and even those who don't. And also this one, How the World Eats. I recommend it to anybody who eats, which is all of us. Okay, so hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Greg. Lovely to talk to you again.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.